The war against Nazi ideology wasn't won solely on the beaches of Normandy or in the rubble of Berlin. One of its most decisive victories occurred in an unlikely theater of operations, across hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps scattered throughout the American heartland, from the cotton fields of Texas to the farmlands of Wisconsin, from the forests of Maine to the orchards of California. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,683 German prisoners of war experienced a transformation so profound that it would reshape not only their own lives but the future of post-war Germany itself. These men arrived as enemies, many as hardened veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, others as U-boat crews, Luftwaffe pilots, and Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought across Europe. They came expecting to find the America that Nazi propaganda had promised them, a weak mongrel nation torn apart by racial strife, crippled by economic depression, soft from luxury and decadence, incapable of matching German military prowess or industrial efficiency. They were convinced that Germany's defeat was temporary, that the Reich would ultimately triumph, that their captivity would be brief. What they discovered instead shattered every assumption they had been taught to believe. They found an industrial colossus of such staggering magnitude that it defied comprehension. A nation that could produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, that built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, that manufactured more military equipment in a single year than Germany had produced in the entire war. They encountered farms larger than entire German provinces, worked by machinery that seemed almost fantastical in its sophistication and scale. They witnessed an abundance of food, clothing, and material goods that made Germany's wartime shortages, and even its pre-war economy, seem desperately impoverished by comparison. But perhaps most transformative of all, they experienced something that 12 years of Nazi indoctrination had taught them was impossible. They were treated with dignity, fairness, and respect by their captors. They were paid for their labor, allowed to organize their own recreational activities, permitted to continue their education, and given access to newspapers, books, and information that revealed the true nature of the regime they had served. Guards addressed them as human beings rather than subhumans. American officers followed the Geneva Convention meticulously, often to the astonishment of prisoners who had witnessed or participated in Germany's brutal treatment of Soviet POWs. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, though it was rarely conceived as such in any systematic way. The American approach to German POWs was driven primarily by practical considerations, legal obligations under international law, and a fundamental belief in democratic values, rather than by any grand strategic design to re-educate the enemy. Yet the cumulative effect of this experience proved more powerful than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. The story of these 371,683 men is one of the forgotten chapters of World War II, a chapter that reveals as much about America at the height of its power as it does about the collapse of Nazi ideology when confronted with observable reality. It is a story of minds changed not through coercion or indoctrination, but through direct experience and undeniable evidence. And it is a story whose consequences would echo through the decades that followed, as tens of thousands of former German POWs returned home, carrying with them a radically different understanding of democracy, capitalism, and what a just society could look like. When Gefreiter Heinrich Böll, who would later become one of Germany's most celebrated novelists and win the Nobel Prize in Literature, was captured in France in 1944, he had spent years consuming Nazi propaganda about American weakness and degeneracy. His journey to captivity in the United States would prove to be his first encounter with a reality so at odds with what he had been taught that it would fundamentally reshape his worldview. The initial ocean crossing was itself a revelation. Unlike the cramped, fetid conditions German POWs in Soviet hands endured, or even the Spartan British camps, the transport ships carrying German prisoners to America were adequate, if not comfortable. Prisoners received regular meals, not lavish, but sufficient and reasonably nutritious. There was medical care for the sick and wounded. The contrast with what these men knew of German treatment of Soviet prisoners was stark and immediate, but nothing could have prepared them for their first glimpses of the American mainland. Hauptmann Reinhold Paubel, a Wehrmacht officer captured in Italy, later wrote in his memoir of the moment his transport approached New York Harbor in June 1944, "We crowded the rails, straining for our first view of America. This nation we had been told was on the verge of collapse, torn apart by race riots, strangled by unemployment, its factories idle, its people demoralized. What we saw instead froze us in stunned silence. The skyline of New York rose before us like something from a fever dream, buildings so tall they seemed to pierce the clouds, hundreds of them clustered together in a display of architectural ambition and engineering prowess that made our grandest European cities seem provincial by comparison. The harbor teemed with vessels, massive cargo ships being loaded and unloaded with mechanical efficiency, warships of every description, ferries, tugboats, private craft. Everything moved with purpose, with energy, with a vibrancy that spoke not of a nation in crisis but of an empire at the peak of its power. I watched my men's faces as we took in this scene. These were veteran soldiers, many of whom had fought from Poland to France, to North Africa to Italy. They were not easily impressed, but I saw shock, confusion, and the first flickering seeds of doubt. If New York looked like this monument to industrial and economic might, what did that say about everything we had been told? What did it say about the war we were fighting? This initial shock was replicated thousands of times across hundreds of prisoner transports. For men who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda depicting America as a declining power, barely able to arm its own forces and dependent on British and Soviet strength, the visible evidence of American power was psychologically destabilizing. For most German POWs, the journey from the ports of entry to their assigned camps involved train travel across substantial portions of the United States. These multi-day journeys became impromptu education in American geography, infrastructure, and industrial capacity, an education that no amount of Nazi propaganda could counter. Oberleutnant Werner Kritzinger, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over France, described his 5-day train journey from New York to a camp in Texas. We traveled and traveled and traveled, and still we had not crossed this country. At first we amused ourselves by counting the factories we passed, massive complexes with dozens of buildings, parking lots filled with workers' automobiles, smokestacks belching the smoke of production. After the first day, we gave up counting. There were simply too many. What struck us most was the redundancy, the excess capacity. We would pass through a city with 3, 4, 5 major manufacturing plants, and then an hour later pass through another city with just as many. In Germany, we had been told that our industrial planning was superior, that our efficiency was unmatched, but efficiency meant nothing compared to this sheer scale. America didn't need to be efficient. It had such overwhelming capacity that it could afford to be wasteful and still outproduce the Reich by orders of magnitude. The trains themselves became objects of fascination. German prisoners noted the quality of the locomotives, the smooth condition of the tracks, the sophisticated signaling systems. They observed the freight trains they passed, endless chains of cars loaded with coal, steel, lumber, grain, manufactured goods. They counted the automobiles at every crossing, stunned by the sheer number of private vehicles even in small towns and rural areas. In Germany, automobile ownership was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or a privilege of party officials. Here it seemed every family had a car, sometimes two. The agricultural landscape proved equally astonishing. Lieutenant Georg Gartner, captured in North Africa and transported to a camp in Kansas, later wrote, "We passed through farmland for days, not kilometers, days. Fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, worked by massive mechanical harvesters that could do the work of 100 men. We had been told that American agriculture was inefficient, that the nation struggled to feed itself. Yet here were farms so vast and productive that they seemed capable of feeding the entire world." I remember one of my men asking in a voice filled with something between awe and despair, "How did we ever think we could beat these people?" It was a question none of us could answer, though it hung in the air unspoken among all of us. The physical conditions of the POW camps themselves delivered another shock to German expectations. Following the Geneva Convention guidelines, the United States established over 500 POW camps across the country, ranging from large base camps housing thousands of prisoners to smaller branch camps of a few hundred men, located near agricultural or industrial sites where prisoner labor was needed. What German soldiers found when they arrived at these camps bore no resemblance to the harsh imprisonment they had anticipated. The camps were certainly not luxurious. They were POW facilities, after all, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But by the standards these men knew, they were remarkably humane. The barracks were sturdy wooden structures, heated in winter and reasonably ventilated in summer. Prisoners slept in individual beds with mattresses, sheets and blankets, a stark contrast to the sleeping arrangements in many Wehrmacht barracks, let alone the conditions that German forces imposed on their prisoners in the East. Each camp had shower facilities with hot water, latrines that met modern sanitary standards, and washing facilities for clothing. But it was the food that perhaps delivered the most powerful blow to Nazi propaganda. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to rations equivalent to those provided to garrison troops of the detaining power. Army interpreted this generously, and German prisoners found themselves eating better in captivity than they had in service, and certainly better than their families back in Germany were eating as the war dragged on and Allied bombing disrupted food distribution. Unteroffizier Kurt Pechmann, held at Camp Concordia in Kansas, kept a detailed diary that documented his meals over several months in 1944. His entries reveal a level of nutrition and variety that would have been enviable in wartime Germany. Breakfast coffee with milk and sugar, porridge with butter, scrambled eggs, bread, jam. Lunch, vegetable soup, roast beef with potatoes and carrots, bread, cake, milk. Dinner, sausages, beans, bread, fruit, coffee, and this was not a special occasion, this was an ordinary day. We could not believe it, even in the best years before the war, few working-class German families ate this well. And here we were, prisoners of war, being fed like this while our guards ate exactly the same food. No separate officers' mess with better rations, no privileged party members receiving extra portions, everyone, guard and prisoner alike, ate the same meals. The egalitarianism of it was almost as shocking as the abundance. The camps also provided recreational facilities that seemed almost absurd to men who had expected harsh imprisonment. There were sports fields for football, soccer, volleyball courts, areas for track and field. Many camps had theaters where prisoners organized their own dramatic productions and concerts. There were libraries, stocked with thousands of books in German and English, reading rooms with newspapers and magazines, classrooms where prisoners could continue their education or learn new skills. Camp Ruston in Louisiana boasted a 3,000-volume library, a full orchestra that gave regular concerts, a theater group that produced elaborate shows, and classes in everything from English language to electrical engineering. Camp Harn in Texas had similar facilities, including art studios where talented prisoners created paintings and sculptures, some of which were sold to local Americans with the proceeds going to the prisoners' camp funds. This infrastructure served a practical purpose. Occupied prisoners were less likely to cause problems, but it also sent an unmistakable message about the values of the society that had created it. These were not the bare minimum conditions required by the Geneva Convention, grudgingly provided. These were facilities that reflected a fundamental belief that even enemy soldiers deserved to be treated as human beings, entitled to dignity, education, and self-improvement. One of the most transformative aspects of the German POW experience in America was the work program. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to perform labor, provided it was not directly related to military operations, was compensated, and was conducted under reasonable conditions. The United States implemented a vast labor program that put hundreds of thousands of German POWs to work across the country, filling critical labor shortages created by military mobilization. What made this program so psychologically significant was not merely that prisoners worked, they had expected that, but the conditions under which they worked and the compensation they received. This was not slave labor or exploitation, it was paid employment conducted under standards that in many cases exceeded what these men had experienced in Germany. German POWs worked primarily in agriculture, though some were employed in food processing, logging, and other non-military industries. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked apples in Washington, cut timber in Maine, worked in canneries in California, and brought in wheat across the Great Plains. The work was often physically demanding, farm labor always is, but it was conducted under regulations that limited hours, ensured rest breaks, and provided for safety. Most significantly, prisoners were paid for their labor. The standard rate was 80 cents per day, paid in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen, or saved. By wartime standards, this was not a large sum, but it was real compensation for real work, a concept that resonated powerfully with men who had witnessed the Nazi regime's use of millions of enslaved laborers from occupied territories, workers who received no compensation whatsoever and were literally worked to death. Unteroffizier Hermann Weiss, who worked on a farm in Nebraska, later reflected on the psychological impact of this compensation: "We were paid for our work." Let me repeat that, because it seemed so important at the time. We were paid. We were prisoners, enemy soldiers, yet we received wages for our labor. We could save this money or spend it on small luxuries at the canteen: chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper. We had agency, however limited. We had been treated as economic actors, not as slaves or beasts of burden. I thought about the Polish workers I had seen in Germany, the Soviet prisoners laboring under guard, receiving nothing but the bare minimum of food to keep them alive long enough to work. I thought about the proclamations I had heard about the superiority of German organization and the inferiority of Slavic peoples, and here I was, a German prisoner in America, being treated better than Germany treated the prisoners in its power. The moral arithmetic of this was impossible to ignore. Beyond the mere fact of employment, the day-to-day interactions between German POWs and American civilians delivered continuous lessons in American values, economic systems, and social organization. These interactions were supposed to be limited, guards accompanied work details, and fraternization was officially discouraged, but in practice, especially in agricultural settings, substantial contact was inevitable. German prisoners working on American farms encountered an agricultural system utterly unlike what they had known in Europe. The scale of American farms astonished them. What would be considered a large farm in Germany was a small family operation in Kansas or Iowa. The mechanization was even more impressive: tractors, combines, mechanical cotton pickers, and other equipment that represented a level of capital investment far beyond what most European farmers could afford. But what struck many prisoners most forcefully was the status of the farmers themselves. These were not peasants or serfs, not tenant farmers working land owned by aristocrats. These were property owners, often quite prosperous, who controlled their own land, made their own decisions, and lived in a style that would have been the envy of many German professionals. Gefreiter Otto Schaefer, assigned to a farm labor detail in Illinois, wrote to his family in a letter that would not actually reach them until after the war: "The farmer I work for owns 800 acres, more land than the largest estate in our entire district at home. Yet he works this land himself, with his sons and a few hired men. His house has electricity, indoor plumbing, a telephone, a radio. He owns 3 trucks and 2 automobiles. His children attend school in town. By any German standard, this man would be counted among the wealthy. Yet here he is considered simply a successful farmer, nothing exceptional. He treats us, his prisoners, his enemies, with a rough courtesy. He ensures we have water to drink, provides a meal at midday, and does not drive us beyond our strength. When the work is done well, he says so. There is no cruelty, no casual brutality. He has a job to do, and we are there to help him do it, and that is the end of the matter." These daily interactions humanized Americans in the eyes of German prisoners, while simultaneously demonstrating the material success of American capitalism. The propaganda image of America as a land of exploitation, where workers were ground down by ruthless capitalists while starving in the midst of plenty, was impossible to maintain when German prisoners could see with their own eyes the living standards of ordinary American working people. The prisoners noticed what American workers ate for lunch: substantial meals, including meat, that would have been considered lavish in wartime Germany. They noticed the clothing American farmers and workers wore: sturdy, well-made, and clearly not the result of rationing or shortage. They noticed the consumer goods visible everywhere: radios, kitchen appliances, tools, vehicles, representing a level of material abundance that had no parallel in European experience. Some German POWs were employed in food processing plants, canneries, and similar industrial facilities that, while not directly contributing to war production, provided support for the American economy. These work assignments offered prisoners an up-close view of American industrial processes and technological capabilities that further undermined Nazi propaganda. The factories were vast, mechanized operations that operated with an efficiency and scale that impressed even skeptical German engineers and technicians. The workers were well paid by German standards, worked regulated hours, and operated sophisticated equipment. There were safety protocols, quality control systems, and management structures that reflected decades of industrial development. Oberkreiter Klaus Fischer, a trained machinist before the war, worked in a food processing facility in California, and later wrote, "I had worked in German factories before the war, and I considered German industrial practice to be world-leading. What I saw in America forced me to reconsider. The machinery was more modern, better maintained, the workflow was more logical. The workers were more productive, not because they were driven harder, but because the systems they worked within were better designed." Most striking was the attitude of the American workers themselves. They were not servile or beaten down. They complained freely about management, about working conditions, about their wages, always about wages. They belonged to unions that gave them collective bargaining power. The idea that workers could organize to demand better treatment from their employers, that this was not only legal but protected by law, was revolutionary to those of us who had lived under a system where independent unions had been banned and replaced by the toothless German labor front. I realized that the prosperity I saw around me was not despite these worker protections, but because of them. When workers were paid well, they could afford to buy the products they produced, creating the consumer demand that drove further production. It was a virtuous cycle that Nazi economic theory had dismissed as impossible, yet here it was, functioning before my eyes. While the material conditions of captivity and work were shifting German prisoners' worldviews through direct experience, the U.S. government also launched a more deliberate effort at ideological transformation. Beginning in 1944, the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office initiated what came to be known as the Re-Education Program or Intellectual Diversion Program, a systematic effort to expose German POWs to democratic ideas, accurate information about the war, and the realities of Nazi crimes. This program was controversial from its inception. Some American officials worried that it violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition on coercing prisoners to renounce their allegiance to their home country. Others doubted that deeply indoctrinated Nazi soldiers could be reached by American propaganda, and still others questioned whether the United States should be in the business of ideological conversion at all. But the program's architects, many of them German and Austrian émigrés who had fled Nazi persecution, understood that they were not dealing with a uniformly indoctrinated mass. Many German soldiers had been conscripts rather than volunteers. Many had witnessed things during the war that had already begun to crack their faith in the regime. Many were simply young men who had never had access to information outside Nazi control and who were intellectually curious about the world beyond Germany's borders. The re-education program proceeded cautiously and indirectly. Rather than crude propaganda or heavy-handed indoctrination, it relied on providing information, fostering discussion, and creating environments where prisoners could draw their own conclusions. One of the program's most powerful tools was simply making information available. Camp libraries were stocked not just with escapist fiction, but with serious works of history, political philosophy, economics, and literature, including many books that had been banned in Nazi Germany. Prisoners could read American newspapers and magazines, gaining access to war news, political coverage, and cultural content that presented perspectives impossible in Nazi-controlled media. The program also produced its own newspaper, Der Ruf, which was written primarily by anti-Nazi German POWs and edited with guidance from American officials. Der Ruf was sophisticated and subtle, avoiding crude propaganda in favor of thoughtful articles about history, culture, and politics. It covered the progress of the war honestly, reported on conditions in Germany, and raised philosophical questions about the nature of government, individual rights, and social organization. Lieutenant Heinrich Fischer, an educated officer from a middle-class Berlin family, later described the impact of this access to information. For years, we had lived in an information bubble. Everything we read, everything we heard on the radio, everything we saw in theaters was controlled by the Ministry of Propaganda. We knew this, of course, but we told ourselves that other nations did the same, that all governments controlled information, and that Germany was merely more honest and efficient about it. In the camp I could read American newspapers that openly criticized their own government. I could read about political controversies, about strikes and protests, about elections where the party in power might actually lose. I could read books by authors of every political persuasion, conservative, liberal, socialist, even communist. The idea that a government could be strong and successful while allowing this cacophony of competing voices was alien to everything I had been taught about the necessity of unified leadership and controlled messaging. Most disturbing and most transformative were the reports about German actions in occupied territories and concentration camps. At first we dismissed these as propaganda, lies meant to demonize Germany. But as more information emerged, as photographs were published, as testimony accumulated, it became impossible to maintain that denial. Some men continued to insist it was all fabricated, but for many of us, a terrible recognition was taking shape. We had served a criminal regime, and we had not known, or had not allowed ourselves to know, the full extent of its criminality. The re-education program also worked to identify and empower anti-Nazi prisoners, giving them leadership roles within the camps and creating space for them to influence their fellow prisoners. This was delicate work, as openly pro-American prisoners risked retaliation from hardcore Nazis within the camp population. But gradually, through careful vetting and protection, the program created networks of prisoners who were receptive to democratic ideas and willing to engage their compatriots in discussion and debate. Discussion groups formed around topics like German history, political philosophy, and plans for post-war reconstruction. Some camps established universities where educated prisoners taught courses to their fellows, covering everything from languages to science to political theory. These educational initiatives were partly about occupying time and maintaining morale, but they also created forums where ideas could be debated and examined outside the rigid framework of Nazi ideology. The camps also experimented with forms of self-governance, allowing prisoners to elect representatives, establish their own rules for camp life within the overall framework of American military authority, and resolve disputes among themselves. These experiences in democratic participation, however limited, were eye-opening for men who had lived under dictatorship for their entire adult lives. Feldwebel Richard Schneider, who served on an elected camp council at Camp Concordia, later reflected, "We elected our representatives by secret ballot. Every man had one vote regardless of rank or party membership. The representatives then had to actually represent our interests. If they did not, they could be recalled and replaced." This was democracy in miniature, and for many of us, it was the first time we had experienced anything like it. What struck me was how well it worked. Yes, there were disagreements and inefficiencies, but decisions were made, problems were solved, and the men felt they had a voice in how the camp was run. The Nazi principle of leadership, that the masses needed to be told what to do by their superiors, was revealed as unnecessary and even counterproductive. People could govern themselves given the chance. As the war progressed and Allied forces liberated concentration camps in 1945, the re-education program faced a new challenge: how to convey to German prisoners the full horror of what had been done in their name. The solution was documentary film, showing prisoners' footage from Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau and other camps. These screenings were among the most controversial and psychologically difficult aspects of the re-education program. Many prisoners reacted with shock, denial or rage, refusing to believe that the footage was real, insisting it was propaganda, claiming that the deaths were caused by Allied bombing or disease rather than deliberate policy. The psychological defense mechanisms against accepting such horror were formidable, but for others, the films were a moment of shattering recognition. Whatever doubts had been growing, whatever questions had been forming about the regime they had served, the visual evidence of the concentration camps crystallized everything into moral clarity. Oberpreutor Paul Hartmann, who viewed liberation footage at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, later wrote, "I watched the film in silence, surrounded by hundreds of my comrades. We saw the piles of corpses, the skeletal survivors, the crematoria, the mass graves. The American officer who introduced the film said simply, 'This was done by Germans, in Germany, in your name.' Then he left us to watch. Some men walked out, some shouted that it was lies, but most of us sat in horrified silence. Because even as our minds tried to reject what we were seeing, some part of us recognized it as true. We had heard rumors during the war, snippets of information that we had dismissed or rationalized. We had seen the beginning of the process, the marginalization of Jews, the deportations, the camps that we were told were for resettlement. We had not wanted to know where it led, so we had not asked questions. When the film ended, no one spoke for a long time. Then one of my comrades, a man from Munich who had been a party member since before the war, stood up and said quietly, "We have done something that can never be forgiven. All we can do now is ensure it never happens again." I do not know if that was the moment when I stopped being a National Socialist, because I think that process had been underway for months, but it was certainly the moment when any lingering loyalty to the regime died completely. While formal re-education programs and work assignments played crucial roles in changing German prisoners' perspectives, some of the most profound shifts came through countless small daily interactions with their American guards and captors. These interactions humanized both sides of the conflict and demonstrated American values more effectively than any lecture or film ever could. The relationship between guards and prisoners in American camps was markedly different from what German soldiers had experienced in their own military or witnessed in German-run POW camps. American guards were generally young men, many had been drafted and would have preferred to be anywhere other than monitoring prisoners in a remote camp, but they approached their duties with a casual professionalism that puzzled German prisoners accustomed to rigid military hierarchy and harsh discipline. Guards addressed prisoners with basic courtesy. They followed rules and procedures rather than arbitrary whims. When they enforced discipline, it was proportionate and predictable. They did not engage in casual brutality, they did not humiliate prisoners for sport, and they treated the Germans under their watch as human beings who happened to be enemies rather than as subhuman creatures deserving of contempt. Gefreiter Wolfgang Müller, held at Camp McCain in Mississippi, later described a small incident that crystallized this difference for him. "I was sick with fever one night, and the guard on duty noticed I was unwell. He could have ignored it. I was just a prisoner, and it was not a medical emergency. But instead he went to fetch the medic, waited while I was examined, and made sure I received medicine, and was moved to a cooler part of the barracks. Before he left, he asked if I needed anything else." This small act of kindness, from a guard to a prisoner, from an American to a German, seemed to encapsulate something essential about the difference between our societies. In the Wehrmacht, I had seen sick soldiers told to stop malingering and get back to work. I had seen officers strike enlisted men for minor infractions. I had seen a culture where strength was everything and weakness was punished. Here was the opposite, a culture where even a prisoner's discomfort was worthy of attention, where kindness was not seen as weakness but as simple human decency. Many guards were curious about Germany and struck up conversations with prisoners who spoke English, discussing everything from hometown memories to sports to politics. These conversations were officially discouraged but practically inevitable, and they allowed each side to see the other as individuals rather than abstractions. The medical care provided to German POWs was another powerful argument for American values. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to the same medical care as the detaining power's own forces, and the United States adhered scrupulously to this requirement. Camp hospitals were staffed by qualified doctors and nurses, equipped with modern facilities, and stocked with medicines that were increasingly scarce in Germany itself. German prisoners received treatment for injuries, illnesses, and chronic conditions. They underwent surgeries when necessary, received physical therapy for rehabilitation, and were given dental care. The quality of this treatment often exceeded what they would have received in German military hospitals, especially as the war progressed and Germany's medical system became strained by casualties, bombing, and shortages. Oberarzt medical officer Friedrich Weber, a German doctor held at Camp Breckenridge in Kentucky, worked in the camp hospital alongside American medical personnel. His post-war memoir provides a detailed account of the medical care system and its underlying ethics. "I had been trained in a medical system that even before the war had been influenced by Nazi racial theories and utilitarian calculations about the value of individual lives. We had seen the T4 program, the mercy killing of disabled people deemed unworthy of life.
We had witnessed the progressive dehumanization of certain categories of patients: Jews, Slavs, the mentally ill, the chronically disabled. In the camp hospital, I saw a completely different approach to medical ethics. Every patient was treated according to medical need, regardless of rank, political beliefs, or nationality. American guards received the same care as German prisoners. An SS officer, a man who represented everything America was fighting against, received the same careful treatment for his injuries as anyone else. The principle was simple and absolute: medical care was a human right, not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on political considerations. I remember asking one of the American doctors how he could treat SS men, knowing what the SS had done. He looked at me with something like surprise and said, "Because he's a patient and I'm a doctor, that's the beginning and end of it." This ethical clarity, this refusal to compromise medical principles even in wartime, even when treating enemies, made a deep impression on me and influenced my entire post-war career in medicine.
Beyond the systematic, institutionalized decent treatment, German prisoners also experienced individual acts of kindness from Americans that defied their expectations and lingered in their memories for decades. There are hundreds of documented stories of American families who invited German prisoners to their homes for holiday meals, despite official discouragement of such fraternization. Farmers who employed German labor often developed genuine friendships with their workers, sharing meals, teaching them English, and sometimes maintaining correspondence after the war. Guards organized Christmas parties and special celebrations, pooled their own money to buy extra treats for prisoners, and went out of their way to accommodate prisoners' requests for letters from home or special religious observances. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Richter, captured at Normandy and held at a small camp in rural Montana, experienced one such act of extraordinary kindness that he never forgot. It was Christmas Eve, 1944. We were thousands of miles from home, prisoners in an enemy land, and the war was clearly lost. Many of us were deeply depressed, thinking of our families enduring their third wartime Christmas, wondering if we would ever see them again. The camp commandant, a Captain Morrison, could have simply let us sit with our misery. Instead, he organized a Christmas Eve celebration. There was a tree, decorated with handmade ornaments. There were extra rations, cookies, coffee, even a small amount of beer. There was a religious service conducted by one of our own men who had been a pastor before the war. And then Captain Morrison himself stood before us and read a passage from the Bible in German, which he had obviously learned for this purpose. His pronunciation was terrible, which somehow made it more touching. He wished us frohe Weihnachten, and said he hoped we would all see our families again soon. Then he did something I will never forget. He told us that he knew we had mothers and fathers, wives and children waiting for us. He said that he understood we were not monsters, we were soldiers, like him who had been called to fight. He said that when the war was over, we would have the chance to build a better Germany, and he hoped we would take it. Then he left us to our celebration. That night, for the first time in my captivity, I wept, not from sadness or fear, but from a confused tangle of emotions I could barely name. This American officer had shown me more humanity, more compassion, more recognition of my basic dignity than I had received from many of my own officers during the war. It made me question everything I thought I knew about enemies and friends, about cruelty and kindness, about which side in this war truly represented civilization. The repatriation of German POWs from America began in 1946 and continued into 1947, a slow process complicated by the devastation of Germany, the shortage of transport, and Allied disagreements about how quickly to return prisoners who might simply rejoin a still potentially hostile population. During this waiting period, many prisoners continued their education, refined their language skills, and discussed endlessly what they would find when they returned home and what they might do to help rebuild their shattered nation. By the time they boarded ships for the return voyage to Europe, these men had spent anywhere from a few months to nearly 3 years in American captivity. They returned as profoundly changed individuals, carrying with them memories and experiences that would shape the rest of their lives. The journey home was itself traumatic in many ways, as it brought these men face to face with the full extent of Germany's destruction. Those who had left in 1943 or 1944 returned to find cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, the economy collapsed, millions displaced, and the full horror of Nazi crimes being prosecuted at Nuremberg and in countless smaller trials across occupied Germany. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, returning to Hamburg in 1946, after 2 years in American camps, described his first sight of his hometown. Hamburg had been one of Europe's great cities, a thriving port, a center of commerce and culture, a city I had known since childhood. What I found was an apocalyptic wasteland, block after block of ruins, buildings reduced to hollow shells, streets cratered by bombs, bridges destroyed, the harbor clogged with sunken ships. People lived in cellars and patched together shelters, scavenging for food, burning furniture for warmth. It looked like the end of the world. But what struck me most was the contrast with what I had just left. America, the nation that had done much of this bombing, was intact and prosperous, its cities humming with life and commerce, its people well-fed and confident. Germany, the nation that had proclaimed its superiority and started a war to dominate Europe, was destroyed, its people starving and demoralized, its cities corpses. The lesson was impossible to miss. Germany had bet everything on military might and racial ideology, and had lost catastrophically. America had built its strength on industrial capacity, democratic institutions, and individual freedom, and had won decisively. The Darwinian struggle that Nazi ideology had promised would prove German superiority had instead proved the opposite. As these former prisoners reintegrated into German society, they became informal ambassadors for democratic ideas and American values. In conversations with family, friends, and neighbors, in letters and memoirs, in community meetings and political discussions, they shared their experiences of America and challenged the residual Nazi ideology that still lingered in portions of German society. This influence operated on multiple levels. At the most basic level, former POWs could testify from direct personal experience about America's economic strength, military power, and material abundance. They could counter Soviet and East German propaganda that depicted America as a capitalist hellscape of exploitation and poverty. They could describe what they had seen and experienced, lending credibility to the idea that democracy and capitalism, whatever their flaws, produced better outcomes for ordinary people than dictatorship and command economies. At a deeper level, former POWs brought home ideas about how society could be organized differently. They had experienced democratic decision-making in camp councils. They had witnessed labor unions negotiating with employers. They had seen free press criticism of government. They had engaged in open political discussions without fear. These were not abstract theories from books, but lived experiences that demonstrated democratic principles in action. Many former POWs became actively involved in post-war reconstruction and political life. Some joined the new democratic parties, the Christian Democratic Union, the Social Democratic Party, and others that were building West Germany's political system. Others went into education, business, or civil service, carrying with them a commitment to democratic values and international cooperation. Lieutenant Ernst Brauer, who had spent 2 years in American camps and then returned to become a teacher and later a school administrator in Bavaria, described his sense of mission. "I felt an obligation to use what I had learned. I had been given an education in democracy, not a formal education, but something more valuable, a lived experience of what democratic society looked like in practice. I had seen that people could govern themselves, that freedom and order were not contradictory, that a society could be both prosperous and just. As a teacher, I tried to pass this understanding on to my students. I taught them about the Weimar Republic's failures, but also about democracy's possibilities. I taught them about American history and institutions. I taught them to question, to think critically, to value evidence over ideology. Many of my colleagues had similar experiences in American captivity, and we recognized that we had a responsibility to ensure that Germany never again fell into dictatorship. The post-war German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder that transformed West Germany from ruins into Europe's economic powerhouse within 2 decades, owed much to American aid through the Marshall Plan and to wise policy choices by German leaders. But it also owed something to the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Germans who had seen American prosperity firsthand and understood what was possible.
Former POWs who went into business or industry often brought with them ideas they had observed in America, modern management techniques, labor relations practices, attention to efficiency and quality, customer service orientation. Those who returned to farming introduced new agricultural methods and technologies they had witnessed during their labor details. The currency reform of 1948, which stabilized the German economy, and the social market economy policies advocated by Economics Minister Ludwig Erhard, found support among a population that included hundreds of thousands of men who had experienced American-style capitalism and seen its results. When Germans were offered a choice between the Soviet-style command economy being imposed in the East and the market-oriented democratic system developing in the West, the former POWs had no doubts about which system worked better. Unteroffizier Otto Becker, who had worked on American farms and then returned to establish an agricultural equipment business in West Germany, explained, "I had seen what modern agriculture looked like, the machinery, the techniques, the scale. I understood that German farming needed to modernize to feed the population and compete internationally. When I started my business importing and distributing American-made agricultural equipment, I faced skepticism from farmers who preferred traditional methods. But I could speak from personal experience about what these machines could do, how they could multiply a farmer's productivity, how they could transform German agriculture. Within a decade, German farms were among the most productive in Europe. We had learned from American examples, not just the technology, but the underlying business principles, efficiency, quality, customer satisfaction, continuous improvement. The economic success of West Germany was built by millions of people making similar choices, applying similar lessons. Beyond the political and economic impacts, the German POW experience in America created lasting personal connections that would facilitate post-war reconciliation and cultural exchange. Despite official restrictions on fraternization, genuine friendships had formed between some prisoners and their guards, employers, and local Americans. After the war, many of these connections were renewed through correspondence, visits, and in some cases permanent relocation. Dozens of former prisoners eventually emigrated to the United States, married American women they had met during their captivity, and built lives in the country that had once held them prisoner. Hundreds more maintained lifelong correspondence with American families who had befriended them, visited America as tourists, and facilitated exchanges between American and German schools, churches, and civic organizations. These personal connections helped humanize both nations to each other and created networks of understanding that transcended governmental policies. They were small threads in the larger fabric of German-American reconciliation, but they were genuine and meaningful to those involved. Jord Puchert, who had been held in Texas and later emigrated to the United States in 1952, reflected, "I had come to America first as an enemy, a prisoner. I returned as an immigrant, an American in the making. In between those two arrivals was a transformation, not just in my legal status, but in my entire understanding of the world. America had not just defeated Germany militarily, it had won me over ideologically, not through force but through example. I raised my children as Americans, but I taught them about Germany too, not the Germany of the Nazis, but the Germany of Goethe and Beethoven, the Germany of hard work and craftsmanship, the Germany that was trying to rebuild itself as a democracy. I hoped they could embody the best of both nations, and I think many children of former POWs felt the same way. We were living proof that enemies could become friends, that reconciliation was possible, that the future did not have to repeat the past." The 371,683 German soldiers who passed through American POW camps between 1943 and 1946 were in a real sense casualties of psychological warfare, though not the crude propaganda warfare that both sides attempted. They were defeated not by lies or manipulation, but by truth and observable reality. They had arrived expecting to find the weak, degenerate America of Nazi propaganda. Instead, they found a nation of staggering strength, material abundance, and democratic vitality. They expected harsh treatment as prisoners. Instead, they received dignity, fair compensation for labor, and opportunities for education and self-improvement. They had been taught that German organizational superiority and racial ideology guaranteed ultimate victory. Instead, they witnessed the decisive superiority of a diverse, democratic, capitalist society that channeled human energy more effectively than any dictatorship ever could. The transformation of these prisoners was neither universal nor complete. Some remained committed Nazis throughout their captivity and beyond. Some accepted parts of what they had learned while rejecting other parts. Some were simply apolitical men who wanted to return home and rebuild their lives without deep ideological commitment to any system. But for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, the American experience planted seeds of doubt, opened intellectual horizons, and provided a compelling counter-model to everything they had been taught. When they returned to Germany, they became a significant force for democratic reconstruction, economic modernization, and Western orientation, not because they had been indoctrinated or brainwashed, but because they had seen an alternative and found it persuasive. The arsenal that changed these minds was not composed of weapons, but of ideas made manifest in observable reality: democratic governance, rule of law, economic opportunity, technological prowess, material abundance, and simple human decency. It was the most effective form of psychological warfare precisely because it was not warfare at all, but rather the authentic expression of American values and capabilities. In the contest between systems that defined the mid-20th century, democracy versus dictatorship, capitalism versus command economy, openness versus control, the German POW experience in America was a microcosm that prefigured the larger outcome. The men who experienced this microcosm firsthand became witnesses to a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure: that free societies, for all their flaws and contradictions, unleash human potential in ways that tyrannies never can. Their transformation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of individuals, became one of the forgotten factors in Germany's post-war evolution into a stable democracy, an economic powerhouse. The arsenal that changed minds proved, in the long run, as decisive as the arsenal that won battles. It was a victory not just of arms, but of ideas, and its effects resonate to this day.